That's okay. So I'm Dr. Leanne and at the medical school at the University of Aberdeen, and I have a particular interest in medical humanities. So that's, I think, why I've been asked to come and chair this session. And Dee, along with the other things I'm going to tell you about, has contributed to our medical humanities history of medicine course over the years. So thank you, Dee, for that. So I imagine most of you know Dee, but Dee Hoole is an honorary research fellow here at the University of Aberdeen. She completed her PhD in 2012 on the children in West Riding Asylum at Wakefield. She's a Yorkshire lass. She's also a social historian and has published research in the last few years, particularly on the dissection of the poor within Aberdeen medical schools following the 1832 Anatomy Act. And this is linked to her current and ongoing research, which is into Aberdeen prostitutes circa 1841 to 1914. So Dee's talk today is on that topic of the dissection of the poor, titled Reclaiming the Unclaimed, the Medical Schools of Aberdeen and the Dissection of the Poor, circa 1832 to 1914. And I'd like to invite Dee to begin her presentation.
Thank you, Leanne and Ellen. Welcome to everybody who wants to listen. So without any ado, we'll start. In the early 19th century, extramural medical schools flourished at Aberdeen. Could I have the first slide, please, Ellen? The next slide, please, Ellen. That's it. Because the medical lecturers at the university were negligent in their teaching, students were said to have to find their own subjects for dissection. In other words, rob graves. The students formed their own association, the Aberdeen Society, the records of which show that on one occasion the husband of a woman who'd been resurrected was paid a guinea, £1, 1 shilling. In 1815, 4 medical students, Alexander Souter, John Campbell, John Ogg, and George Middleton, were found guilty of resurrecting a body from the grave. Each of them spent 14 days in prison and were fined collectively £100, approximately £3,300 in today's money. And it was paid to the Lord Provost for the benefit of the Royal Infirmary. A few years later, in 1827, another medical student, Alexander Crombie Mackenzie, robbed the grave of a farmer outside the city. He was spotted bringing the body back into the city, and his father, who was a baker, allowed him to hide the body in his flour store, which actually his business was ruined overnight. But Alexander Crombie Mackenzie's own career didn't suffer. He became a surgeon and later a burgess of the city. Therefore, Aberdeen anatomy students were trading in human bodies before the Anatomy Act of 1832, when the only legal method of obtaining corpses was from the gallows, since it was only permitted to dissect the corpses of murderers by the Murder Act of 1742. So there were few opportunities for the anatomists. The transition from exhumation to murder was made by the Burke and Hare murders that unfolded in Edinburgh in 1828. They had killed at least 16 people and delivered their bodies straight to the anatomist of Dr. Robert Knox. There were lurid newspaper reports up and down the country of the trial of Burke, and he was subsequently dissected, and his dissected body was put on public display in the premises of Alexander Munro. In London, 2 copycat Burkers, Bishop and Williams, were hanged in December of 1831. They had murdered an Italian boy and sold his body to the anatomists, but they admitted 3 more murders and over 500 resurrections. Next slide, please. The 1820s and 1830s was a period of suspicion, distrust, disease and unrest. And during November 1831, cholera was confirmed for the first time in Britain at Sunderland, just 70 miles south of the Scottish border. And despite all efforts, cholera spread rapidly. People began to mistrust doctors, suspecting the medical profession of allowing cholera patients to die in the hospital and then performing unauthorised dissections on the victims. So there was social tension as the poor believed that they could become the potential subjects for the anatomists. So choleraphobia and burkophobia coexisted in the winter of 1831-32, and these contemporary cartoons show a flavour of the despair at the time. Notice the skeleton supporting the table and death disguised as a doctor. There were riots up and down Britain during 1832, in Glasgow, Manchester, Nottingham, Leeds and Bristol, ostensibly concerning the electoral reform, but they were bound up with concerns over dissection and anatomy. The anatomists were popularly called cutters up. Next slide, please. At Aberdeen, just 9 days after the London burkers were hanged, the newly built anatomy school of Dr. Andrew Moyer was destroyed by a mob on the 19th of December 1831. It had only been opened weeks before, but was already viewed with suspicion. It had a sinister appearance, with blacked out windows and bad smells emanating from the building. It was called locally the Birkin House, but on that December morning, a dog unearthed human remains in the backyard of the anatomy school. Children raised the alarm and the building was stormed. Dr. Moyer and a couple of students fled for their lives. There were 3 partly dissected cadavers on the premises. They were seized by the mob and paraded around the town, causing more Aberdonians to join the melee, which was said to be 1/3 of the population of the city. The anatomy school was set on fire, and the fire engine which tried to attend was denied water, and the attendants were threatened. And although the military was called out, the Lord Provost wisely did not deploy the troops, thus preventing bloodshed. And when the fire was out, the walls of the premises were kicked down and the rioters went home. Later, 3 men were charged with being the ringleaders of the riot and jailed. But one claimed that he'd only gone there to see if his grandmother, who died 3 weeks earlier, was one of the cadavers being dissected in the medical school. Ultimately, a negligent porter was blamed for disposing of the remains in the yard of the anatomy school. But since he was only equipped with a very small coal shovel, burying anything in a December evening by candlelight in Aberdeen might have proved challenging. Dr. Moyer himself moved to new premises, but his reputation took time to rebuild. By 1839, he became lecturer of anatomy at King's College. However, he died young, aged 38, in 1844 from typhus fever, and it seems likely that he caught this disease from it when he was dissecting a corpse. His corpse was never dissected, and he's buried in a large tomb in St. Nicholas churchyard. Moyer was described as Aberdeen's first great teacher of anatomy and was well respected. He said book anatomy, and even that gained from lectures would not do. Dissection, he said, was the foundation of anatomy, and only dissection would support the science. However, the Aberdeen riot highlights the need at the time for regulation of the schools of anatomy. And just 2 months after the Aberdeen riot, a second attempt was made to introduce an anatomy bill to Parliament. The first anatomy bill had failed in the House of Lords, largely because the clergy objected to it. And in order to get the second bill through Parliament, it was made more ambiguous and it was simplified. Consequently, there was little detail in the Act, and this was to cause problem for the next 150 years. By August 1832, the Act to regulate the schools of anatomy became law. Subsequently, the unclaimed bodies of people dying in institutions, in hospitals, in asylums, and prisons could legally, and for the first time, be handed over to the anatomists. It's generally thought that the Act ensured a supply of subjects to the anatomist, but that took time and effort. Next slide, please. After the Anatomy Act, an Inspector of Anatomy was appointed for Scotland. From Edinburgh, he travelled periodically to inspect the medical schools, ensuring that the provisions of the Anatomy Act were being carried out. In Scotland, funeratories were set up in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Aberdeen, and they operated in slightly different ways, but common to them all was the supply of unclaimed bodies from the various institutions concerned with the welfare of the poor. At Aberdeen, the Funeratory was established in 1833, and it was found in a small court, conveniently, that's my dog, conveniently next to the medical school at Marshall College, and immediately across the road from the school, there were lodging houses in the extremely poor area of Guest Row, where the tenements and vicious courts were situated and where disease was rife. Bodies were removed around the city under cover of darkness to avoid any undesirable gossip. They were kept for 48 hours at the funeratory, and if unclaimed by the end of this period, the body was dispatched to the medical schools for dissection. The funeratory quickly became part of the legal mechanism that facilitated the supply of anatomical subjects. It was described as just a workhouse dead house in a convenient site, but the Aberdeen Herald newspaper, more realistically, regarded the funeratory as a trap for catching bodies for dissection. The funeratory became part of the ritual of death for the poor, but it disguised the fact that many did not reach their graves intact. The absence of discussion of the funeratories allowed them to operate relatively smoothly throughout the 19th century in Scotland, and the superintendent of the funeratory lived on the premises and was paid a salary of £26 a year. The lecturers of the medical schools were responsible for the operating costs and the costs of interment for all the unclaimed bodies that were brought to the funeratory. And this saved the parish authorities the cost of a pauper funeral. Of course, the cost of a pauper funeral would be ultimately paid for by the ratepayers of the parish, and they were never in danger of being dissected themselves. One of the major problems with the anatomists was that there were difficulties with the guardians of the poor, who by the Anatomy Act were the ones that were empowered to dispose of unclaimed bodies. Some declined to send pauper bodies to the anatomists, even though it saved the cost of the pauper's burial. But fear of dying in the workhouse became a real and lasting terror for the destitute poor. Next slide, please. Requests were made for bodies to be sent from towns like Dundee, but the Inspector of Anatomy was convinced that such schemes wouldn't work. He said the Anatomy Act needed to be worked quietly and not attract public attention. Otherwise, it would endanger its working. For the Inspector of Anatomy, it was a matter of discretion and secrecy undertaken by an almost invisible government department, consisting of just one inspector. From 1859, the two poor law parishes of Old Macker in the west of the city and St. Nicholas in the east, where the poorer areas were, became the principal sources of bodies. The paupers and the destitute sick from the two poorhouses and from the infirmary. 34% of all subjects for dissection came from St. Nicholas poorhouse, 25% from the relatively more affluent parish of Old Macker. So 59% of all subjects were from these two institutions. The infirmary supplied 14% of cadavers, and the records show that some pauper bodies sent to the funeratory were claimed and buried by their relatives, but these were in the minority. As the register on the slide shows, at the end of the month, each lecturer was required to pay the funeratory fees for the number of corpses received, which paid the expenses of the funeratory. The prices shown were for entire bodies, those that had not undergone a post-mortem. The lowest price paid for a body by the lecturers was just 5 shillings in 1848. However, an adequate supply of bodies remained a persistent problem throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Here are a few brief details of some of the people dissected. A mother and baby died in St. Nicholas poorhouse in 1852. The baby had been stillborn on the 19th of December, and just 5 days later, Eliza, aged 25, died. Both were sent to the medical school of Dr. Redfern at King's College, but it's unlikely that their remains were buried together, since they were interred on different dates in February 1853. The oldest subject to be dissected was David, recorded as being 104 years old. He was dissected in 1869, and unsurprisingly, his cause of death was recorded as debility of age. But suicides, accidents, violent deaths also provided subjects for the anatomists, and there were other unclaimed subjects removed from their own homes and found drowned in the harbour, or in the case of newborns, often abandoned on the links. Next slide, please. Was there ever an adequate supply of bodies which the Act appeared to promise? Well, not really. From the Anatomy Act in 1832 to 1902, a period of 70 years, approximately 250 bodies a year were anatomised in Scotland. Just 20 to 30 bodies a year were dissected in Aberdeen. Some bodies were given up by the anatomists from time to time. The bodies were sent for dissection but subsequently claimed by their relatives. For example, James, aged 45, was a lunatic who died in the asylum. His unclaimed body was sent for dissection in March 1897 and reclaimed by his relatives almost 2 months later. It's perhaps indicative of strong family ties that the family did track his remains down, but there cannot have been much left of James to bury. A number of unclaimed cadavers that were dissected are of people who migrated to Aberdeen and died of illness and disease far away from their families. And because Aberdeen was a port, there were foreign sailors who became the subjects, notably Canadian, German, Dutch and American citizens were all dissected in the medical schools. Many subjects died of infectious diseases, which often posed a threat both to the students and to the lecturers. This was a period when infectious disease was rife. There were few effective remedies for major diseases, and before the mid-19th century, there was little attempt to disinfect areas of surgery or wards in hospitals. Dissection for both students and teachers was a hazardous business. Next slide, please. In 1860, the two colleges of King's and Marischal College amalgamated to form the University of Aberdeen. Dr. Lizars became the first professor of anatomy, but he was allowed to resign just 3 years later in 1863 because of his dipsomania, his alcoholism. Dr. John Struthers from Edinburgh was appointed in his place. For almost 30 years, Struthers held the post until his retirement. And after Struthers took over the post of teaching of anatomy at Aberdeen, he improved teaching methods and facilities for the students, with new dissecting rooms, a lecture theatre and a museum. And any unusual specimens taken from dissections were preserved in the Anatomical Museum. During Struthers' time, the medical students increased significantly, from 87 in the winter of 1863 to 290 in the winter of 1890. 3 times more students than under Dr. Lizars. And the focus became instilling professionalism in medical students. Struthers was actively involved in the new content of medical teaching, the new system that was introduced in the 1880s. And he became an influential board member of the British Medical Association. And he was instrumental in keeping the subject of anatomy and Aberdeen Medical School at the forefront of the new medical teaching. Dissection was seen as a tool for technical, emotional, and professional teaching. Dr. Reed, his successor, maintained the reputation of the medical school, establishing an anthropological museum and society. But the dwindling number of subjects for dissection from the end of the 19th century became an urgent matter, with bodies routinely sourced from other towns in the north of Scotland. Next slide, please. Contemporary medical men were well aware that dissection was viewed as an abomination by many in society. One particular example of this is to be found in 1897, when a corp cray, a Gaelic voodoo-like doll made of clay and studded with iron nails, was sent to the anatomy department of the medical school. It came from Western Scotland, where superstitions still abounded. And as this clay effigy disintegrated, so the health of the recipient was meant to fail. It seems likely that someone from the community in the Western Isles had been anatomised at the medical school before anybody was able to claim the body. And this was a clear response, the equivalent of a pox on your house. There's no record of any person within the department being affected by this sinister practice, but a visiting Oxford professor of anthropology was supposed to be spooked by it. Next slide, please. Talented Aberdeen artists G.S. Cameron and Alberto Morocco during the 1940s and 50s produced beautifully detailed drawings of body parts dissected in the anatomy department at Aberdeen. They were probably used in teaching medical students and are still kept in the department. Yet detailed as these drawings are, they depict a rather sanitized version of dissection. Clearly, the photograph of the dissecting room is realistic, showing a partly dissected cadaver on the table, demonstrating that some work was being done on the corpse. The brain is missing, and so is the top of the skull. There are few such photographs of the anatomy department. But the medical school at Aberdeen grew in prominence and became a leading provider of medical education, and the cadavers that were dissected must have played a significant part in the growth. Next slide, please. The purposes that the bodies of the largely destitute and anonymous poor were put to throughout the 19th century reflect the cultural and social values of the period. The unclaimed dead poor were seen as legitimate subjects for the anatomists, allowing the bodies of the rich and respectable to lie undisturbed in their graves. My research has identified 1,699 individuals who were dissected in the medical schools at Aberdeen between 1832 and 1914. The records held here at Aberdeen show the names, the ages, the occupations, the place of death, the date received for dissection, as well as the place and date of burial. And it's important to acknowledge each and every one of the dissected poor, young or old, diseased or not, for the contributions they made to the progress of modern medical science. Last slide, please. To conclude, this has been a brief glimpse of the working of the Anatomy Act and the use to which the bodies of the dead poor were put to. We owe all the socially disconnected bodies of the anonymous paupers, the unwanted and unclaimed, who became the subjects of medical science, a debt of gratitude. But the dissected did not have tidy burials. Most of these individuals were buried in the mass unmarked small section of the cemetery reserved for the poor, like this one at Nellfield, where at least the dissected remains of 1,000 people were buried between 1860 and 1910. And not all were buried in individual coffins, but were jumbled together with others, and sometimes only a bag of remains were buried. Some of the bones were found buried in the walkways, but the Nellfield scandal of 1899 is a whole other story. We have to respect the persons whose bodies were used for medical research and training without their consent, which continued into the mid-20th century. And it's only through press publicity in the 1950s that the bequeathment of bodies became acceptable to the public. By 1972, the anatomy department at Aberdeen held over 1,000 bequest notices, which finally allowed an ample supply to the medical school at Aberdeen 150 years after the Anatomy Act. Thank you for listening.